Hello, my name is Alex and I'll talk about the most powerful layout system currently available in CSS, the grid. They are part of my speech. What is a grid? Browser support, basic terms, container properties, properties of items. What is a grid? CSS grid layout, aka grid, is a two-dimensional grid-based layout system, the purpose of which is to completely change the way that web-based user interfaces are designed. CSS was always used to lay out web pages, but it never did that job good. At first, we used tables, then wraps, floats, positioning and inline blocks. But all of those methods are essentially just hacks and omit many important functions. For example, vertical alignment. Flexbox helped, but it is designed for a simpler one-dimensional layout, not for complex two-dimensional ones. In fact, Flexbox and Grid work very well together. CSS Grid is the first modular created specifically to solve layout problems, which unit how now we have solved using hacks when creating web pages. Browser support. Here we see the table that shows current browsers and numbers of their stable version that work with Grid. As we see that full coverage is without prefix, around 89% and global around 82%. Basic terms. Here we see the basic element of the grid, which we will discuss in the next slides. Grid container. The element to which display grid applies. It is a direct parent of the grid element. In this example, container is a container. Grid item, the child element of container. Here item is a grid item, but not a sub item. Sub item, the child of the grid item, and it does not inherit the grid. Grid lines is a horizontal and vertical grid container delimiters. Those lines are on either side of the column or row. They have direct and reverse numbering. Grid track is a space between two adjacent grid lines, vertical columns or horizontal row. A grid cell is the smallest indivisible unit of the grid container that can be referenced when positioning grid elements, formed at the interaction of the grid row and grid column. Grid area is a space inside the grid of container into which one or more grid elements can be placed. This element can consist of one or more grid cells. Container properties. Let's talk about the container properties. Display defines the element as a container and sets a new mesh formatting context for its contents. Grid template column and grid template rows defines the column and rows of the grid using a list of values separated by spaces. Values represent the size of the track and the spaces between them represent the grid lines. When you leave empty space between the track values, the grid lines automatically assign numeric names. We can see that our previous code would do. If your definition contains duplicate parts, you can use the repeat notation. The FR fraction unit allows you to customize the size of the track as a part of the free space in the container. Here is an example that sets each element 1/3 the width of the container. Grid template areas defines a grid pattern referring to the names of areas that are sets using the grid area property. Repetition of the names of the region leads to the fact that the content covers those cells. Dot means empty cell. Here we see how it code works. Notice that you don't name the lines, just the areas. If you use this syntax, it will be automatically named. Grid column gap and grid row gap specifies the size of the width of the lines. You can think of this as setting the width of indentation between columns and rows. Here we see how it code works. You can use a short gap recording like this. Justify items aligns the content along the line axis. This value applies to all grid elements within the container. How it code works. Align items. Align the content along the column axis. This value applies to all grid elements within the container. You can see it here. Justify content. Sometimes the total mesh size may be smaller than the size of the container. This can happen if all grid elements have fixed units, for example px. In this case, you can set the alignment of the grid inside the container. This property aligns the grid along the rows and row axis. Here we see how it code works. In this case, you can set the alignment of the grid inside the container. This property aligns the grid along the axis of the column. You can see it here. Property of the child element, grid item. Let's talk about the grid item properties. Grid column start, grid column end, grid row start, and grid row end. Determine the location in the grid referring to specific lines. Grid column start, grid row start is the line of which the element starts, and grid column end, grid row end is the line on which the element ends. This code works like this. Another example to better understand how it works. An example of how it can be written shortly. Grid area gives the name of the element so that it can be referenced using the property created to the grid template areas. Alternatively, this property can be used as a shorthand for grid row start plus grid column start plus grid row end plus grid column end. Here an example. So, in the end, we will talk about justify self and align self. Justify self. Align the content of the element along the axis of the string. This value applies to content within a single item. You can see it here. Align self. Aligns the contents of the element along the axis of the column. This code works like this. That's all I have. Thank you for watching. See ya!